Hi, everyone. My name is Alex. I teach high school chemistry, biology, and neuroscience. Thank you so much for coming to my inquiry presentation where we will discuss curiosity as a stance toward learning. This is our roadmap. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my journey to inquiry and how I'm defining curiosity. Then we'll take a look at my literature, how I've collected data, my teacher moves and findings, and finally, my implications. So let's get started. A little bit about myself. I am a Chicana woman, meaning I am an American woman of Mexican descent, though have been white passing all of my life. I grew up in independent schools, and those were predominantly white institutions. So these are both pictures of me at different independent schools. This is me in the third grade with my sister, and this is me in high school with a friend. While I had wonderful experiences at these independent schools and had a really high quality education, at the same time, like many people at these schools, I felt the need to assimilate. So a perfect example is while I do have pretty curly hair, I often straightened it as I did in both of these photos. I also never saw myself represented in the faculty, particularly the STEM faculty. So now, as a science teacher, I think about this a lot in my classroom. Because of my epistemic privilege, I'm really aware of marginalized identities in my classroom and how those students might be feeling. So I ask myself, are they male? Are they female? Are they white? Are they a student of color? Because all of this informs my practice and how I show up for my students. I also think about the fact that science has historically been considered an objective discipline, though I do disagree with that narrative. And science teachers have often taught the discipline as if there's one right answer. And we know from Tema Okun's white supremacy characteristics that one right way is a white supremacy characteristic that has historically been used to oppress people. So I think about this a lot as a science teacher, which leads me to my journey to inquiry. So coming into my first year teaching, given my past experiences, I really had one foundational goal driving me through the year, and that was to cultivate a safe and inclusive classroom. I wanted my students not only to feel safe, but to feel like their questions, their opinions, and their perspectives were necessary to move science, not just in our classroom, but globally forward. We need multiple new perspectives to move the discipline forward. And I will say that I think I accomplished this by the end of the year. I had a couple of students with marginalized identities tell me at the end of the year that they felt like they wanted to take more science classes and potentially pursue science because they felt like they could really do it, which really says something about representation and being aware of your students' identities. And at the same time, I was feeling this tension because I felt like my class was almost too easy by the end of the year, and that students were almost like complacent or like too comfortable in my classroom, which was really weird because it was this paradox. If I want them to feel safe, but they feel like too comfortable and I feel like they're not being challenged. And I think that this was coming right at a time where there were some really like scary things happening in the world. There were the Palisades wildfires down in SoCal. The National Guard troops had just been deployed in LA, which is not too far from us. And ice raids were starting to run rampant. So I felt like I was doing some sort of moral wrong by letting my students feel complacent. And I was starting to realize that comfort and safety and discomfort are not mutually exclusive. In fact, you really need your students to feel safe and comfortable in your classroom in order for them to be productively uncomfortable and to challenge them and push them into the land of discomfort in learning so that because that's where real learning happens, is that discomfort, and then bring them back out of it and then bring them into it again. But in order to do that, you need them to feel safe and you need to create a safe environment for them. So in my second year, that was my goal, to find that balance. So through many iterations of my inquiry question, I ultimately landed on how can my students and I embody curiosity as a stance toward learning. Now, I didn't choose curiosity out of the blue. I was very specific about this question, or about this word. According to experts in the field, curiosity is perturbed harmony, so pointing to data that are inconsistent with the cherry-picked model of knowledge. I really like this phrase, a perturbed harmony, because I want my students to feel harmonious in my class. And at the same time, I sort of want them to start to reckon with like what's really happening in the world that might not directly impact them, but it's happening not too far away. So I wanted to perturb their harmony. Curiosity is also the desire for new knowledge, information, experiences, or stimulation to resolve gaps or experience the unknown, and it can be fostered by reducing uncertainty and humanizing science. My literature was in three buckets: curiosity, science pedagogical moves to spark that curiosity, and then humanizing science. The literature in humanizing science tells us that when we bring real world issues into the classroom, no matter what your discipline is, you often click into the empathy of students and you reach a greater number of students and can spark those kids' curiosity as well. So I collected data in multiple ways: teaching journal or student journals, my teaching journal, student interviews, assessment questions at the end of units, and colleagues' observations. I had four major teaching moves: storytelling, inquiry-based pedagogy, discussions in science, and reflection through journaling. So let's look at all four. Um, so this is a video that I actually showed my freshman biology students at the beginning of our genetics and inheritance unit. This is a video of Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which is a genetic disorder. So what I did was ask my students just to observe this video, make observations. Then through a scaffolded activity, we started to ask questions, and then we categorized those questions into different categories. And then those were our driving questions for the unit. So if it was coming from the students, the content was coming from the students, and at the same time, it was the content was always going back to Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So there was always context. So the idea of storylines are coherent lesson sequences with the ultimate goal of explaining an overarching phenomenon. And then lessons within the storylines are linked to student questions. And I know from my neuroscience background that our brains actually remember stories better because there's an arc. So I was just continuing to try to create that arc to spark curiosity in my class. Through a mentor, I also became versed in inquiry-based pedagogy and employed that. This is a pedagogical approach that drives learning through presenting knowledge gaps. So it's easiest to understand inquiry-based learning through the hero's journey that they often use in film. So first, we need to call our students to adventure. That's the engage piece. Then we need to allow them to explore this threshold between the known and the unknown. So we present something to them. There are things that they might know about whatever we present to them to engage our students, but there are also questions that they might have that they might not be able to fully explain what's going on because there's an unknown. And that's where the piece presenting a knowledge gap comes in, right here, the threshold between the known and the unknown. Then the mentor or helper comes in. You can think of this as like Yoda. This is the teacher explaining. This is more lecture-based pedagogy. Then we need our students to elaborate. This is the transformation that begins to happen. Then the atonement, that's evaluate. And then we return back to our call to adventure. I also employed discussions in science. I really admire humanities disciplines for having such fruitful and hard conversations in their classes. I think that discussion is a great way to learn when you're verbally talking things out and you're realizing you're wrong and you're reflecting and you're hearing others' perspectives and you're updating your model of knowledge. It's just a really great way to learn. So I asked myself, why are we not doing that in science? So I utilize specific discourse strategies like debate or finding holes in our own beliefs to maintain curiosity. By encouraging students to challenge their own explanations and those of their peers, my goal was to challenge students to constantly refine their mental models as they encounter new evidence. Finally, I had journal reflections to generate questions, develop hypotheses, elicit emotions, make connections, and reflect on the process. And these journal reflections were also meant to help students identify and navigate those knowledge gaps that we talked about earlier. Okay, so now we're at my findings. Finding one is that there have to be preconditions to foster curiosity. So these are two student journal entries about feeling like we need the norm of acting like you have no clue if a person is talking from experience or not, confidentiality, and a judgment-free space. We were having really vulnerable discussions in our classes, and students felt like we need to feel safe not only with our teacher, but also our peers in order to have those discussions and ultimately spark curiosity. This is a teacher journal entry about a student who I had taught previously in chemistry, and this student was taking my neuroscience class, and they were worried that they wouldn't be able to do well in the class. So they asked me if they thought that they should drop the class. I, of course, said no and encouraged them to stay in the class. And then a week into neuroscience, they came to office hours and said that they were so happy that they didn't drop because it was their favorite class. So this is telling me that the precondition for curiosity is believing in our students and telling them, I believe you can do this. This is a colleague observation. They saw safety for risk-taking, and that sense of safety was a marker of curiosity in practice. Finding two is relatability to and connection across content begets curiosity. So in a second, you'll get to hear from a student that says this pretty perfectly. Take a listen.
Always interesting. It's easier to learn stuff when it really connects to you. And so I think that's why neuroscience is really interesting because it's about us.
In another interview, I had a student reflect on our teenage brain project. So students were learning about how the teenage brain is different from those of adults. And the student said, I'm such a perfect kid. I'm not really stressed, but recently it's been horrible. College and stuff. Everything is stacking. It's interesting to see why that's happening. So allowing her to explore her own brain sparked her curiosity. These are reflections from chemistry. In chemistry, we did some demonstrations to show the relationship between pressure, volume, temperature, and moles of gas. And these two students said that they really liked it because they realized how much pressure is in everyday life. This student was reflecting on a lab that we did with electrons, and the flame changes colors, and they said they liked it because it reminded them of lightsaber colors, so something that they can relate to. Finding three is narrative pedagogy begets curiosity.
Well, remember this day.
So I showed that Oppenheimer video because that's exactly what I showed my students to begin our chemistry class. We grounded a lot of our content in Oppenheimer and in the atomic bomb. This student said that they really liked learning about the atomic bomb. They love knowing and going deep into learning things that are really impactful in our world. So this is the humanizing science piece. So we're bringing in a narrative and we're also humanizing at the same time to beget curiosity. And then this I just think is funny. Learning about it gave me a sense of what everyone was stressing about while making it. And then these are journal reflections on Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, DMD, from my freshman bio students. This student said they really liked learning about it because they worked at a summer camp with kids who had DMD. And so it was interesting to see what they were going through. This student liked it because it was a real issue. This student said it helped them become more aware of people. This student said it was fascinating that such a tiny mutation can have such a big effect. And this student said that they've never had a teacher teach through this narrative pedagogy before. So this was really indicative that this DMD thing, it worked. My final finding is that teacher passion is necessary for student curiosity. This student said that Alex's passion for teaching and commitment to not only helping us learn, but also learning something herself made each day of neuro attention grabbing and enjoyable. The thing that I really want to pay attention to here is learning something herself. So what I found through my inquiry is that in order to spark our students' curiosity and in order for them to have a commitment to learning, we need to model that same commitment as well. So this is a perfect example of that. I got some really tough feedback from a student, and rather than just ignoring it, I sent it word for word to a colleague and said, can you please just help me think through this and improve my practice? My first implication is that to sustain curiosity, science educators must transition from being knowledge droppers to narrative-driven facilitators who integrate storytelling, inquiry-based learning, and project-based learning. My second implication is that independent schools, I believe, must move away from departmental silos toward interdisciplinary alignment to capitalize on student connection making. And my final implication is that embracing an amateur mindset and modeling professional vulnerability for students is essential for dismantling the perfectionism trap in independent school environments. Thank you so much to my students. I believe in your curiosity. You're the reason I've fallen in love with this career. Thank you to my Penn Fellow friends, Rose, Janine, Romel, Caitlin, and Sierra. And then my D-Star Fellows, congratulations. You should be so proud. We should all be proud. You're all amazing teachers. Thank you so much.